such conceptions. Emerson's conception of America, calling it this new yet unapproachable America, adds a dimension to perceptions of America from abroad, as it is an America that you can find once you have withdrawn from it. Withdrawal here is a condition for being born into it or being born again, as Emerson says. Once you are born again, you will realize that this unapproachable America is nearer to yourself than you had realized. This is something, a little bit of what I think I learned from Emerson. Now, then another stage of my relationship with Emerson came about 10 years ago when I was asked to translate a book dealing with the relationship between Henry David Thoreau and Emerson into Korean. This experience, parenthetically, taught me that I am not a translator. But this gave me a chance to read a few of Emerson's early essays a bit more carefully. However, the opportunity to consider Emerson's work as a whole and to consider him as a particular kind of thinker came a few years later, when I began to study the work of a Korean thinker named Hamseok. Allow me to give a brief description of his work, his life, and his work. Okay. Born in Korea in 1901, roughly 2 decades after Emerson had died, Hamseok pursued a unique philosophical thought that embraced both Eastern and Western traditions. He later became a Quaker, and it was his American and English Quaker friends who translated some of his writings into English and have in recent years maintained a website devoted to his thought. I consider him to be the most important intellectual in the 20th century Korea. His philosophical and religious works became an inspiration to the first generation Minjung theologians and also to the Korean theologians committed to the work of indigenization and inculturation of Christianity in Korea. He was also an intellectual in the Gramscian sense. During his life, he was imprisoned multiple times by 4 different national authorities. By the Japanese colonial authority when Korea was under the colonial rule of Japan, and by the Soviet authority immediately after Korea's liberation in 1945, also by the North Korean authority before the Korean War, and on multiple occasions by the South Korean authority. All these imprisonments were because of what he had said and what he had wrote about independence, liberation, freedom, and democracy. During the 1960s and 70s, he was the leading dissident and an opposition leader in the movement against military government in Korea. The way he protested was through writing and publishing his essays, giving speeches charged with prophetic declarations and metaphysical speculations. There are 30 books in the most recent publication of his collected works. A part of the work that the Center for the Study of Korean Christianity over the years has been to study and promote the significance of Hamseok's work. So what does this have to do with Emerson? For some time now, I have been trying to think about the ways of making sense of Hamseok's work in English and in the Western context. Thinking about his work, my mind has wandered into thinking about Emerson. And this so far is roughly my conclusion, that Hamseok did for Korea what Emerson did for America. What Emerson tried to do for America was by suggesting a different way of approaching life and finding our relation to it. What he ended up doing was to found a tradition different from the one he inherited. We can say something similar about Hamseok's work in Korea. Along the way, there are remarkable similarities in their conceptions of God, humanity, and conformism in the universe. Even without comparing their works in any theoretical terms, I think we can see some convergences in their biographies. Both had public falling out with the church on doctrinal matters. Emerson declared that he could no longer administer sacraments. Hamsakhon declared that he could no longer believe in the idea that someone other than yourself can atone for your sins. Both were found to be heretical in their views by the dominant churches. Both found inspiration from Hinduism, and Hinduism was important in shaping both of their works. Hamsakhon found Hinduism while he was in prison and even translated Bhagavad Gita into Korean. Neither had any academic position. Both of their writings were mainly in the form of essays, lectures, and occasional poems. They were both the representative thinkers of their countries. They both had meditative qualities in their writings and qualities that are best captured in hearing rather than reading. Now, having delineated how I came to Emerson's work, let me go back to the claim I made earlier about Emerson's work having not been taken up theologically, at least not adequately. Before we examine some of the reasons why Emerson's work might not have been adequately taken up theologically, we need to examine the thesis statement just a little bit. In order for this statement, my statement, to make sense, I think you have to agree that there is a theological quality to his work. I believe most of you would agree to that extent, but would you also agree that Emerson was doing theology or that his work was theological in nature? I think here we get into a little murkier territory. Whatever you think about Emerson's work at this point, it is undeniable that throughout our history, Emerson's work has been predominantly regarded as a literary expression. This is how Emerson's work gets introduced in high school and in college introductory courses. There is no reason to deny that he led the American Renaissance of the 19th century, and many of our greatest writers in this country found inspiration from Emerson. It was also as a literary thinker that his name became a sanctified name in America. Emerson himself would agree that his writings were literary expressions. But what literary means and what these expressions were expressions of is less clear. Although I don't intend to provide any clarity to this here. One possible reason for suggesting that Emerson was a literary thinker and not a theological thinker is that he left ministry after 3 years and never came back to it. Moreover, whenever he had a chance, Emerson distanced himself from the historical Christianity and its dogmatic claims. One of the first sermons of Emerson ever published was the most famous one out of all the sermons he preached at the Second Church in Boston, which was the one in which he declared that he could no longer, in good conscience, administer the Holy Communion, thus thereby cementing the publication of the sermon, cementing the view that Emerson left not only his church, but Christianity and theology, holding heretical views. There is another possibly related rationale for suggesting that Emerson was a literary thinker only and whose theological interest should only be a historical one. Here I am wondering whether the fact that he was a Unitarian minister is not used as an excuse to treat his work more historically than theologically, as though his Unitarianism makes it possible to see his work more as a literary product of imagination and mystification. Something similar can be said about his relationship to Asian religions. I don't think we would have the kind of Emerson that we do have today without the Asian religions, such as Hinduism. While he left a deep legacy through his engagement with Hinduism, for example, it also left an impression and a suspicion in American public mind that this religious engagement was a sign of abandoning Christianity and moving into the literary and imaginative and mystical world of Asian religions. What this impression and suspicion denies is the possibility of theological and philosophical claims that these intellectual traditions of Asia can make and do make on people, including people like Emerson. This lack of theological interest has a long history, and it has a CTS connection. CTS's former president, Arthur Cushman McGifford, was the first person to have edited and published many of Emerson's sermons in 1938. It was an important event in the history of Emerson's scholarship, though I don't think it was taken as so. In his autobiographical work, McGifford recounts the story behind the publication. He talks about how he first got introduced to Emerson's grandson, who had Emerson's sermons in his possession, and how he was allowed on his first visit to see the manuscripts, only to look, but not to touch them. After he was finally allowed to touch and then to edit them, he encountered yet another problem. The famous publisher, Houghton Mifflin, did not want to use the word sermon in the title of the book. McGifford explained the situation quite nicely, that the publisher did not want the word sermon in the title because such books do not sell well. But I suspect the decision was not an isolated one, as it was an acknowledgement and a recognition of what kind of thinker Emerson was. Perhaps they couldn't really conceive of, even then, Emerson delivering sermons. So McGifford and the publisher came up with a misleading title for the book. The title says, Young Emerson Speaks, Unpublished Discourses on Many Subjects. Deception in advertisement has a long history. And turning the first page, we notice something else too. That is, how many times the book has been checked out of the library. 7 times in 1940s, once in 1950s, and twice in 1980s. Trust me, I'm not making any kind of scientific claim about this, but I do really love the history that books contain and books become. And given the criteria we were using to read out our library books when we were moving into this building, this book, if this book was not written by one of our former presidents, it would not have met the cut and surely would have been thrown out completely. The name of Emerson appears once in the book McGifford wrote on the history of CTS from its beginning to 1960s, the book entitled No Ivory Tower. Here, McGifford, speaking of Samuel Bartlett, who was among the first 3 professors called to professorships here at CTS when it was first founded. McGifford says that when Bartlett was a student at Andover Seminary in early 1840s, he had been deeply stirred by the writings of Carlyle and Coleridge. Then he goes on to say that Bartlett may have been one of the people Emerson had in mind when he wrote in his journal in 1842 that he had been told that at Andover they sell shelf full of Coleridge's book, year. If Bartlett, who spent decades teaching at CTS and went on to become a president of his alma mater, college back, and his name is an important name in American higher education, but that's another story. Now, if Bartlett read the British Romantic writers like Carlyle and Coleridge in 1842 in America, near Boston, then I'm almost certain that he also read Emerson's first book, Nature, as did Henry David Thoreau. Emerson championed the cause of Carlyle and Coleridge in this country and had a significant relationship with Coleridge through correspondence. And I haven't done the necessary research to see whether Bartlett's reading of Carlyle and Coleridge and possibly of Emerson was reflected in his teaching career at CTS, but that remains a curiosity. Now here you can see that I am trying really hard to justify this CTS connection here. I am trying. Even after President McGiffort's pioneering work making Emerson's sermons available for theological investigation, people who wrote about Emerson's sermons and about his engagement with Asian religions tended to be professors of literature. And this tendency continues to be true today. This sense of relative lack of theological interest in Emerson's writing is particularly notable if we think about the amount of attention, even devotion and passion people in theology have paid to the works of Søren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche. I consider the work of Emerson to be comparable to those of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, not only in terms of the contents of thought, but also in terms of achievement. By achievement, here I have in mind such elements as their place in the history of thought in the 19th century, and what they did to the inherited wisdom of the Western tradition. And here I'm tempted to ask, what would Emerson of American scholars say about that? It has been known, I have known, that Friedrich Nietzsche was a great admirer of Emerson's work, but the extent of that relationship was something I learned about only recently. In a book called American Nietzsche, the author Jennifer Ratner Rosenhagen talks about how Nietzsche discovered Emerson at a young age when he was at a boarding school and spent decades dialoguing with Emerson's work. Nietzsche regarded Emerson as a mentor and a brother's soul. He considered Emerson to be a new kind of thinker who did the kind of intellectual work that was not possible in Europe. He called Emerson the most fertile author of the 19th century. Emerson's books were the most heavily annotated books in Nietzsche's library. On the margins of Emerson's book, Nietzsche would write such euphoric comments as, "Here comes German 101, bravo, ja, sehr gut, herrlich, das ist wahr." The author says that Nietzsche's Emerson books were worn with repeated use, their texts scarred with underlines and covers, margins, and even fly leaves were covered with notations. This is just a fascinating stuff as far as the history of ideas is concerned. Fascinating. Not to dwell on it any longer, I think it is fair to say that some of our fascination with Nietzsche is our fascination with Emerson, interpreted through Nietzsche. Assuming that we would agree that there is evidence to suggest that there has been a lack of theological interest in Emerson's work, I will turn to the second part of my title, my proposal and the title of my address today, that one of the ways in which we can take up Emerson's work theologically today is by studying his work as a source of theology of religions and considering Emerson as a thinker of religions. There's just no question about Emerson's deep engagement with Asian religions, first with Hinduism and later on with Buddhism and Confucianism. But it was with Hinduism Emerson had an abiding interest in, which began when he was a young man and continued until the end of his life. And he led the first generation of Americans who found inspiration from Asian religious tradition. Let me mention a few things that we can learn from Emerson's engagement with Asian religions. First of all, he was not following a trendy wave of intellectual interest in Hinduism. Having declared his disillusionment with historical Christianity, he was trying to find a more adequate conception of the divine, and he found something he liked in Hinduism, and he never looked back. Emerson rejected historical Christianity and with its doctrines and rituals and literal interpretation. What he found in Hinduism was a possibility of an original, unmediated, intuitive relationship with the divine and the universe. This possibility for Emerson was to be achieved, materialized, through seeking the God within or God within ourselves. The way he engaged Asian religion was not by compartmentalizing his thought. He did not have one compartment for nature, one compartment for God, and one for individualism, and one for Asian religions. In other words, Hinduism was not a separate chapter in Emerson's thought. What he learned from it was diluted into the fabric of his thought and into the fabric of who he was and who he was to become as a human being. In almost all the major writings of Emerson, it is possible to see what kind of dialogue he was having with non-Western, Asian sources. Of course, they were not the only sources of dialogue and inspiration for him, but they must be counted as essential to Emerson's thought. So essential that Emerson reformulated much of his entire thought through that engagement and dialogue. What we get from that reading of Emerson is an account of a fascinating thinker, a thinker who tried to hear the call of the divine in traditions far different than the one he inherited. He understood Asian scriptures to be the sacred text of all people, and he was not using them to be esoteric or to add to the eloquence of his rhetoric, as some might suggest. In his work, the Hindu idea of karma finds an analogy in the notion of compensation, and Emerson's notion of self-reliance can be construed as an answer to the question of how to live with the law of karma. In the Hindu identification of Atman and Brahma, we see traces of Emerson's notion of the oversoul, which he understood as the divine in human consciousness, and the God within. The oversoul in Emerson was the divine. And also we find in Emerson the very important Hindu idea of Maya. And this gets sort of translated and illustrated in his notion of illusion. The doctrine of reincarnation is interpreted in terms of fate in Emerson. There are dialogues that he carried on with Asian sources are to be found, as I said, in all the major writings of his self-reliance his essay experience as compensation, circle, and so on. While I believe that we can find a model of dialoguing with other religions in Emerson, it is not without problems. In my survey of the train, it seems to me that people in Asia have been a lot more generous in appreciating what Emerson was trying to do in the mid-19th century. I have seen, on the other hand, all kinds of criticism leveled at Emerson, some frivolous, but others more serious. Some have criticized Emerson for not having enough knowledge of the Asian religions. This, to me, is just silly, because what Emerson was doing was not philological research or scientific investigation into religions. Rather, he was expanding his thoughts about God, nature, the universe, and his own self with the resources that was available to him. What was available to him was rather meager compared to what is available to researchers today. He first acquired the translation of Bhagavad Gita, which he referred to as the first of books, in his mid-40s only. A little more substantive charge is that Emerson only took what he wanted out of those religions. What he took out of Hinduism, for example, was ideas that spoke to him. Certainly, he was not interested in rituals and religious practices.